What's up, everybody? It's Ben here, and we're going to dive right into some limited ratings. Alright, I'm really excited for this set, a lot of cool design, and no real point in delaying any longer. We're going to be going on the 5.0 scale for those of you who have seen my ratings before, those of you who have seen LSV's ratings before. Um, this means everything up to about a 2.0 is considered filler or not playable in your main deck, or a good sideboard card sometimes. We're looking 2.0. It's like the cards you don't mind playing one of. They're kind of around your like 23rd in good decks. They're cards that are good but not great, and will usually make play in your main deck. 2.5, we're looking at the backbone cards, cards that pass the vanilla test, um, cards that do a little bit but really are just role players for your deck. 3.0, we're talking good utility cards, situational removal. We're starting to get up to that level of power. 3.5, we're talking good removal. 4.0, we're talking 2-for-1s, good bombs but not great bombs. 4.5, we're talking great bombs. And my own personal little touch here is that I typically only give one 5.0 each set. So my 5.0 goes to the best limited card for the set. Now let's start with white here. Starting off pretty big with Acclaimed Contender. 3-mana 3/3 is obviously passing the vanilla test. Although 3-mana 3/3s have been getting a bit of a bad rap lately, obviously still a good body. There's a bit of a list of situations here, so it's not quite as consistent as it would be in standard. However, the list of situations isn't particularly difficult, especially if you're building around this card. And this card is obviously a supported archetype, so when it does trigger and you get to draw a card, 3-mana 3/3 draw a card, and draw not just any card, an action card is massively good. That said, it's still utility, and there's a certain limit to how good utility cards can be. We've seen cards like Militia Bugler, which was a very good utility card as well at 3 mana. Less conditions, but still a couple conditions. It's kind of similar to Acclaimed Contender, honestly. When Acclaimed Contender is good, it's better than Militia Bugler. When it's not good, it's worse. Overall, still going to give it a 3.0. Just a really good utility card. Not quite at the cap of utility cards, but certainly close. All That Glitters. Not a big fan of this card. Definitely going to put it around the 1.0, 1.5 range. And the reason for that is, yes, it counts itself, but when we're talking about enchant creatures, auras that enchant creatures, there's always that inherent risk for getting 2-for-1s, so you really want a big effect the turn it comes into play in case your opponent has a sorcery speed answer or something else like that, a bounce spell. You're obviously putting a whole card at risk here. The amount of upside you're getting for 2 mana should equate to that. And for that, I would like, let's try to imagine a number where this card would be good. 3 is pretty close. I would say a little more than 3. Not quite 4, but a little more than 3. And I would be good playing this card because of the impact it had the turn you played it. Obviously, enchantments like this have been much better when they hold keywords like flying or lifelink because of the effect that they have immediately, whereas this one doesn't give trample or anything evasive or any sort of life gain. So the impact it has can be very minimal, especially if your opponent just chump blocks. They can still get value out of this. Just not a particularly good card. You're definitely going to have better artifacts and enchantments to play. Archon of Absolution. So we're looking at the, I always like just calling it the Cloud Manta body, even though I know that's not technically correct in terms of it being a white. There is a white comparison. But 4-mana 3/2 flyers are always okay. They're not particularly good or particularly bad. They're just at the playable level, so I like that. Protection is massive. I'm always a big fan of protection. It's not always relevant, but when it's relevant, it's one of the best keywords in the game, if not the best, so hugely massive upside here. This last line is not completely irrelevant, but it's not amazingly relevant. It's going to be very good when you're playing this card on curve. It's kind of like a pseudo... So evasion obviously pairs really well with lifelink, with vigilance, with keywords that let you be a little bit defensive with your evasion as well, so you can start winning the race pretty handily. So this last line kind of gives you that upside. It's not quite as good as something like lifelink or vigilance would be. Maybe about as good as vigilance, considering this body is only 2 toughness. However, it is still acting as that sort of upside on the flyer that helps you win the race. So overall, I'm a big fan of this card. I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan of this card. Again, it is just an okay body. And while this keyword is relevant on turn 4, it does fall off fairly quickly. It's hard for me to give this card a 3-5. I'm going to give it a 3-0, but it's kind of on the borderline there. It's closer to a 3-5 than a 2-5 for sure, but I can't quite give it a 3-5. Against white decks, it's obviously a 3-5, but not every deck's going to play white. Arden Veil Paladin. So 4 mana for a 2-5 body is pretty good. I mean, it's not excellent. Once we start getting up to these mana costs, we're starting to try to look for aggressive creatures to help get us a lead or push a lead. Whereas a 2-5 body is not aggressive at all. It's not a good attacker. It's very prone to being double or triple blocked for very little value. That said, it is a good blocker in case you're playing a defensive deck. And the Adamant for getting a +1/+1 counter makes this a 4 mana Siege Mastodon, which typically costs 5. Might as well since we have Gather Up. Better than Siege Mastodon. It has a whole extra toughness. Not particularly relevant, but not irrelevant either. This being a 3-6 is massively different from it being a 2-5. It's very hard to profitably double block 3/6s just because 3 damage is significantly better than 2 damage. It's 33% better, and obviously they would need to double block with creatures that have more than 3 toughness in order to just eat this, which is a lot harder of an ask than double blocking or triple blocking with creatures with 3 or more toughness, which is common enough that this wouldn't get value. So really you're looking for a 10 plus planes deck to really make this pop off. But heavy white decks are actually going to really like this card. Yeah, if you're really heavy white, like if you're white with a splash, I'd go so far as to say this is a 3-0. Just very big for the cost when you get the counter. If you can't really reliably get it, if you're playing like a 10-7 deck, this does go down quite a bit. Probably down to like a 2-5. And obviously if you're playing less than 10 planes, I probably would avoid this card. It is technically still playable if you really need a defensive creature on 4, but it's kind of a stretch for if you're not at least somewhat reliably getting this counter, especially if you can get it earlier so you can start attacking. Arden Veil Tactician, so our first adventure creature here. We're looking at a Chapelgeist. Might as well, we have Gather Up, so Chapelgeist was obviously very, very good in Innistrad, and even though creatures have gotten better, Chapelgeist has remained a very good body. So overall the body is already a 3-0, and we're looking at this upside of being able to Dizzying Swoop on top of casting Arden Veil Tactician. How much of an upside is it? It's not that massive. Typically you're going to want to cast this on curve, and on turn 2 you're not really looking to tap down a couple creatures. Where this card really shines with Dizzying Swoop is if you're ahead on board and you can Dizzying Swoop on your turn to get a good attack in, and then follow up with an evasive creature, set up some really aggressive lines. So that is nice upside, but really it's hard to ever say that casting... There are some spots where casting Dizzying Swoop and then casting Dizzying Swoop on their turn is better than casting Tactician on your turn, but the difference being 1 CMC, Usually it's going to be better to just cast Tactician and not hold off by casting Dizzying Swoop, but sometimes you're so far behind on board that you want to just swoop. But those are never great situations where a 2/3 flyer isn't going to help you turn around the board at all. Overall, I'm a big fan. I don't think Dizzying Swoop being attached to this puts it up from a 3/0 to a 3/5. I think it is nice upside, but not that nice. This is still just a very good utility card and a good beatdown flyer. Yep, 3/0. Bartered Cow. So we're looking at Hill Giant stats. Not too frequent that you can just flat discard this somehow. It is technically possible, but I don't really think that's massive upside. Hill Giant is no longer vanilla. For those of you who don't know, the vanilla test has changed for 4-drops in particular. It's very, very evident these days that you're looking for Summit Prowler instead of Hill Giant for your 4 CMC cards. The extra power is pretty standard these days, and it is significant, especially for trying to get through more defensive decks. But just in general, 3/3s are just not cutting it for 4 mana anymore. Getting a food token is upside, but it's not massive upside, especially in white. Even if you pair like white-green, white-black, something like this, it's just not a lot considering you're paying too much for a 3/3 body these days. Yeah, overall, it's just too expensive, and the upside isn't good enough to justify that expense. And this card will get me a 1.5. Though it is closer to a 2.0. If I could put it somewhere in between, I would. But don't overrate this card. It's not a card you typically want to play. Beloved Princess. 1 mana, 1/1 lifelink. Not a fan so far. Can't be blocked by creatures power 3 or greater. Still not a fan. People will always look to these sorts of cards and say, well, it's a 2-point life swing for 1 mana, so isn't it good? The answer is no. Because creatures that the difference between this and like a 2/1 for 1 is first, a 2/1 for 1 gets in significant damage to the point where once you start curving out with other creatures, you can you can say that you've made an impact on their life total. And second, 2/1s for 1 are able to potentially trade up, and they also do much better in combat. They don't get chump blocked, or they don't just get eaten by 2/2s for 2, which is a massive deal. And yeah, the clock they put in is more significant and more aggressive, which is always, well, most of the time better. Beloved Princess just is going to get eaten by everything. 1/2s, 2/2s, 2/3s. There's not a lot of 1/2s that are typically playable, but still, this trades off with tokens. This is just not where you want to be spending a whole card. Even if it is technically a 2-point life swing, the damage is not significant for aggressive decks, and the life gain is not significant for control decks. Not enough to make this worth an actual slot in your deck. I got to be pretty hard on this one, though there is certain conditions where this is playable, notably if you're really heavy on equipments and auras, and this is like your 23rd card. If you can consistently get this to a point where it's something like 2/3 or better, then you're looking at something with potential upside. But we're going to be pretty harsh on this one because most always you should not be putting this in your deck. So we're going to put it at 1.0. There are certain circumstances where it's okay, but usually it's not the case, so don't try to force it. So something you pick up like 14th, 15th pick, and then realize later that, okay, this might actually be okay in my deck. Charming Prince. So we're looking at a bear. Bears are never that bad, especially if they have upside. Bear with Scry 2 is really good. Bear with Gain 3, not quite as good as Scry 2 most of the time, but it's nice to have the option. And Bear with Flicker. These are all very good and situational enough that they're all quite relevant modes. Typically what you're going to be looking at here is Scry 2, but these two have their place and can be better in certain circumstances. But a bear that scries 2 is just excellent value. A very good utility creature, 3.0. Circle of Loyalty. So this is one of the earlier cards that was spoiled, and I spent some time thinking about it for limited. Knights is a supported archetype, but we have to think about how much we'd be willing to pay for this and be happy. So Anthem effects are typically worth 3 mana. They're sometimes worth 2. Honestly, I put Anthem effects somewhere between 2 and 3 for them to be particularly good. Something like 2.6, 2.7 mana is typically what we're looking at. This third line is not super relevant. It could come up, but I'm not going to really factor it into the converted mana cost. It's not worth a significant amount of mana to have that attached in most decks. This last line, however, is very significant. Being able to mana sink to make 3/3 or to make hill giants on your Anthem, because the creatures get +1/+1. They are technically 2/2s, but they are 3/3 vigilance tokens for 4 mana, and they didn't cost you a card. This is an excellent mana sink in the late game. On top of this Anthem effect, I'd be very happy to pay 4 mana for this card. Not very happy, but 4 mana is about what I'd expect for a card like this to be good. So we're looking at having 2 knights on the battlefield. That's not a big ask, it is a bit of an ask, but the fact that you don't have to have 2 knights on the battlefield, you can just cast this later on in case you didn't get the knights on the battlefield, and it's going to win you the late game, is a significant upside. Not too much to say. It's a good card, it's not a great card. It's a 4.0. It's at that good bomb level, but not the great bomb level. It's not going to win you games outright on its own. Like, it actually is, but it's going to take a while. And the time and the fact that this is like the late game win condition kind of factors into how bomby it gets. Anyway, Deafening Silence, 0, don't bother. You might be thinking you can get really cute with Deafening Silence in like an aggro deck, but typically your aggro cards are going to be lower CMC, so this is going to get in the way more than it helps. In your control decks, you're not going to want to spend a whole card on this. You'd rather play something that can block or play something that gives you some other type of advantage. This is definitely a constructed card, don't bother in limited. Fairy Guide Mother. Now, I hate that this card exists because it exemplifies a lot of things that I don't want to be doing with my mana. 1 mana, 1/1 flyer is not something that's worth your time almost ever. It takes very particular circumstances, it takes mechanics that work with it for it to ever be good. Healer's Hawk was good because of the lifelink and because they had Convoke and Mentor in the format, and being able to grow Healer's Hawk was significant in a very big way. Flying Lifelink is a classic combination if you can get those stats up. So 2 mechanics that worked with it, plus the lifelink as well, was just a lot to put on Healer's Hawk. But now everybody's suddenly starting to think that Suntail Hawk is playable, and that's just not the case. Typically your 1 mana 1/1 flyers are just complete garbage. They don't put on a clock, they don't block, they don't attack well. They don't really do anything well besides hold equipment, and that's never worth a whole card, especially when your other creatures can hold equipment just as adequately, or just about as adequately. So, not a big fan of this side. When you add in Gift of the Fae, does that make the card playable? That's the real question. So, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I've been going back and forth on whether Gift of the Fae actually makes this card playable. My ending is that it's playable, but it's still filler. This is not something that you want to be pursuing very highly. The fact that this is sorcery speed is a big, big downside. If you could cast this Gift of the Fae at instant speed, that'd be really nice. If it had +2 or +1/+2 in flying, I think I'd like it a little better, but no, actually +2, +1 in flying is better than +1/+2 in flying. This is considered reach for your aggressive decks, which is kind of nice. So there are some aggressive decks that are going to like to play this. The aggressive decks that are playing with a significant amount of equipment or auras that boost power and toughness can reasonably play this, but really you want those decks to be also lacking in reach and lacking in options for reach for Fairy Guide Mother to really be good. There are going to be better reach options than Gift of the Fae. However, this entire package is a bunch of mediocre things stuck together, that none of which is worth a card, but altogether is almost worth a card. So not a high pick, but certainly you could consider it. I think it goes around a 1.5, but it could be a 2.0. I could definitely eat my words on that one. Just very hard to rate a card like this because it's two typically unplayable cards put together. Flutterfox. Gift of the Fae would be unplayable? Yeah, probably. Mighty Leap is significantly better, and Mighty Leap didn't always see play in decks. Anyway, Flutterfox. 2-mana 2/2. So bear's fine. The upside is if you control artifact or enchantment, it is flying, which is a massive upside. Yeah, the difference between a bear and a bear with flying is huge. 2-mana 2/2 flyers are always great. Even without flying, this creature does perfectly fine. So this is like a 2-drop of choice for me. It's not ever going to be like Gustwalker levels. Gustwalker was insane, didn't require any synergy, and attacked as a 3/3 flyer. Flutterfox, it's just going to be a pretty solid card. In the right deck, Flutterfox goes up to a 3/0. Typically, it'd be closer to a 3/5. It really depends on the number of cards you have that work with this. If you're looking at 4 or 5 cards that work with this is closer to a 2/5. If you're looking at about 6 or 7 cards that work with this, we're getting closer to that 3/0 level. Yeah. Fortifying Provisions. So 3 mana. Oh yeah, this is just not good. Obviously, +0/+1 is not worth 3 mana. We're talking +1/+1 is worth about 2.6 mana. +0/+1 is not an effect that's good enough or significant enough to actually be on the mana scale. It's like talking about a 1-mana 1/1. Yes, we can talk about the value of a 1-mana 1/1 in terms of its mana cost, but it's too low impact to justify even talking about the mana cost. Does attaching some life gain onto this make it playable? The answer is no. Does attaching food synergy to this card make it playable? The answer is still almost certainly not. This just doesn't do really enough to justify it, even in committed food slow decks where this would theoretically be at its best. It's just still not good. So yeah, avoid, definitely. Even with enchantment synergies, like none of this matters when the card is basically a blank card. It's not a blank card, but it's pretty close. It's much closer than you might think to just having no text. So yeah, 0.5, avoid. This should be a stick in packs, but I know people are going to overrate it. So, moving on. Giant Killer, card I'm a huge fan of. Obviously, the tap cost is reasonable and the body is ignorable because tappers act as removal, and the chop down. So you have like instant speed, Smite the Monstrous for 1 less mana, which is already really quite good. So that's already kind of that 3.0 level. But after you Smite the Monstrous, you get another removal spell in terms of a tapper, and that's just a huge package. This is the sort of 2-for-1 removal I can get behind. There's just really no reason not to pick this really highly. It's not a bomb per se, but it's at that level of a bomb where you're getting a really, really good 2-for-1, where it is actually a 4.0. Glass Casket. Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of creatures that you're typically going to want to remove for 2 or less mana, CMC at least. Cards like Giant Killer, I guess, but even then, they're pretty few and far between where typically what you have on board can deal with most of the creatures that this can't hit. So Glass Casket is pretty close to just being an unconditional removal spell. The fact that it's an artifact could be considered downside, but it's more likely than not going to be upside for you. The artifact and enchantment synergies go up in value when you have Glass Casket. And typically that's going to be way more relevant than your opponent and artifact removal, especially since that's going to have to be sideboard and they're only going to have 1 or 2 copies at most. So Glass Casket overall, just excellent. 3.5, very good removal spell. Happily Ever After, and as I recall, this is just a hodgepodge of nonsense. Yeah, so this card is not good. It says each player draws a card, so you might be thinking, okay, cantrips. But the fact is, you're spending a card on this. So you're playing like a discard a card, draw a card, where you're giving your opponent just a draw card. And the difference between rummaging and drawing a card is obviously very, very big. You're giving your opponent card advantage for you having a little bit of card selection. The gain life is not particularly relevant. It's not completely irrelevant, but it's usually not relevant. This is a card that some people are going to try and design around in a constructed format, but the rest of the text is basically irrelevant for limited, and the top line is better for your opponent than it is for you, so typically it's actively bad to play this card. So if I could give it a negative rating, I would, because it does less than nothing. It actually hurts you, but we're just going to give it a 0.0. But feel free and treat this as like a negative 1.1 million. Like, just don't ever pick this, don't ever play it. If your opponent plays it, smile. Anyway, Harmonious Archon. 6 mana, 4/5 flyers. This is a bit overcosted for its flat body, but not significantly. At a certain point, you have to realize that once you get up to that 4/4 plus in terms of flying bodies, there's not a huge difference between them. They're all going to close out the game really quickly, and that's really what you're looking for. Now, really what we're looking at is these 2 abilities, which is pretty ridiculous because you're getting, while this is in play, you're getting 2 3/3s. But let's say they remove Archon immediately. You're getting a 4/5 flyer and 2 1/1 humans, so they cast a removal spell. You're still getting a Raise the Alarm through their removal spell, and that's the worst case scenario. And that's a really, really good scenario for you. While this is on the field, you're getting so much. What's a card that puts 2 3/3s? 2 3/3s with no text. I'm thinking about Crested Sunherd, or Crested Herd Caller. But those give those are trample 3/3s. There's one more recently. This is green white wear, like Tristani? No. Oh. It's the one that makes the 3/3 wolf. The rare. But let's just talk about Crested Herd Caller, because frankly 3/3s with trample are not significantly different from 3/3s without trample. It is slightly different, but not hugely. So you're getting like, let's even be generous and cut off a whole CMC for it. So while this is on the battlefield, you're getting, let's say, this body's worth somewhere between 5 and 6 mana. We'll be generous. We'll be a little harsh on this card to try and get you to understand just how much value this gets while it's on the battlefield on its own. So we're going to call it something like 5.3 mana for the 4/5 flying body itself, which I think is fairly reasonable. You can make arguments whether it's worth more or less. It's probably around there, honestly. And an additional 2 3/3s. It's probably worth. It's worth more than 4 mana for sure. Crested Herd Caller was a great Magic card. 2 3/3s. I'd always pay 5 mana for 2 3/3s. I think, even if they don't have trample. So 5 plus 5.3 mana, plus you have to factor in probably something close to 0.7 to 0.8 mana for the fact that it's a 2-for-1 combined into 1 card. And effectively the CMC you're getting for this is like 11. You're getting like 11 mana worth of cards, which should get you to understand just how ridiculous this card is. Obviously, it's not quite that simple. You could have big creatures that get shrunk. You could have Other small creatures that get big to increase the value of this card. Your opponent could have some creatures that get bigger, which decreases the value of this card. But all things considered, this is a definite, really, really powerful bomb. And even if your opponent removes it, you're going to get very good value. Getting a raising alarm through removal is obviously still a good sign. 4.5, this card is incredible unlimited. Alright, Hushbringer. Why? I really don't like the fact that they put lips on this card. Like, this stick... It's like watching one of those cooking shows where they're like, you could have just taken this off and you would have been just fine. It's like, why did you put this on the plate? Why did you put this in the art? Like, this, I like what's going on here. Why is this here? Why is this here? Why are these, like, these mouths? Like, unnecessary. Getting way too fancy. Anyway, ignoring the art now. Looking at 2 mana, 1/2 flying lifelink. So yeah, this is obviously worse than Healer's Hawk for a number of reasons. I know I was talking about the combination of flying and lifelink, but at the same time you have to note that this is 100% more expensive than Healer's Hawk, and Healer's Hawk also had 2 mechanics that made it function. By itself, Healer's Hawk is strictly not playable. With 2 set mechanics that made it better, it was good. But when we talk about Hushbringer, not only are there not mechanics like Convoke and Mentor that grow it with reliability or use the creature for casting spells, but also this card is twice as expensive. The difference between a card that costs 1 and 2 is significantly different than a card difference between 2 and 3, etc. as you go up. Even so, would I even pay 1 mana for this card? Potentially. Like, this last line gives it a little bit of value, but really, this could affect you just as negatively as it can affect other people. And frankly, the body isn't good enough to justify main decking it. This could be a sideboard card, and that could be interesting, but typically most decks, especially white decks, especially with this flicker nonsense that we have going on in white, are not going to want to stop ETB effects or dying effects. It is possible, but I'd keep it in your sideboard. 1.5, this could be a good sideboard card, but don't play it main deck. It's too expensive, it doesn't put on a clock. Yes, if you have enough artifacts and enchantments that increase the power and toughness, this card does become okay. But at the same time, the symmetric effect can hurt you as well as your opponent. So, and it is quite expensive for the fact that it basically does very little on its own. A lot of people are going to really like this card though. So where I would take it, probably like 10th to 13th pick. Other people are going to be taking a 5th to 8th pick, and that's just way, way too high for a card like this. Knight of the Keep. We've seen a lot of this exact card before. Obviously the Knight tag is relevant, but not relevant enough to make a card that's below vanilla test playable. So yeah, 1.0. Linden, the Steadfast Queen, on the other hand. A lot of decks are going to be heavy in one color, so if you're heavy in one white, a 3/3 Vigilance for 3 is obviously a very good deal. The attack upside with the life gain is nice. It gives you some value the turn you play Linden, which is always good, and it gives you some value in the long run. It's not significant enough to really change Linden's rating. Linden in 10 planes decks is probably going to be looking at something like a 2.5 to a 3.0. It's probably closer to the 2.5 scale. Linden in basically mono whites with a splash is looking at a 3.0. It's just a very good card, but not anything super stellar. Lonesome Unicorn. So 5 mana, 3/3 Vigilance. This is way too expensive. This is about 1.5 mana too expensive. You're looking something probably even more than 1.5. I'm probably looking at like 1.6, 1.7 mana too expensive. 3/3 Vigilance is worth about 3.2 mana. So paying 5 is ridiculous. Attaching Rider in Need to it, which is a whole 0.8 CMC too expensive. When you combine cards, typically you want to add about 0.7 in terms of their value. So we're looking at, yeah, this card is still way too expensive for what it does. This is, like, if you attach this to a vanilla card, I'd like it. But you're attaching this to a very expensive, not good card. And the combination of these two things doesn't make it good. So you're paying 3 plus 5, which is something close to about 6.5 mana in consideration because you're paying the mana separately, and you don't strictly add when you're paying separate costs on different turns. You kind of have to split the difference to a degree. So we're considering this card about 6.5 mana, and you're getting a 2/2 Vigilance and a 3/3 Vigilance. Those don't attack particularly well, so the Vigilance is very null. And when you consider the fact that we've been getting like Call the Cavalry, 2 2/2s with Vigilance for 4 mana, the fact that you're getting a 2/2 Vigilance and a 3/3 Vigilance for 6.5 mana, a whole extra 2.5 mana for just +1/+1 in stats, and that's ridiculous. That's like the difference between paying 3 mana for a 3/3 or paying like 5 mana for a 3/3 Vigilance, yeah. So yeah, card is basically garbage, like way, way too expensive. Even with Synergy, I can't ever imagine playing this card. 1.0, just not good. Mysterious Pathlighter. So Windrake's always nice, always welcome. The upside, he's actually pretty good. I'm a big fan. It's like, even with this card is still too expensive. That should get you to understand just how bad this card is. Anyway, I'm just a big fan. I mean, I'd always play this card, but the fact that it can sometimes get +1/+1 counters is nice. It bumps it up from that borderline 2/5/3/0 to just being a 3/0. It's nothing that's too stellar. If you have a billion adventure cards somehow, like 7 adventure cards, then I could see this going up to a 3/5, but it's particularly hard to do that, and even then, it's still just like really good utility. This almost always is just going to be a 3/0. Outflank. I'm sure we've seen a card like this before. So, mob something. Not mob justice. No. What am I thinking of? Like riot something? I can picture it in my head. There's this dude and they're like all rallying, and it's like it was the 3 CMC card that dealt damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature. It's 1 red. I can see the artwork, I just can't remember the name of the card. Even still, when we're talking about a card like Outflank, you need to recognize that even though this is 1 mana removal, it relies on both having creatures, your opponent attacking or blocking. These are 2 conditions that are just way too much to ask for it to ever be something considered in like even situational removal level. That said, 1 CMC is really hard to read and the instant speed is nice, so it's not unplayable. It's just very, very, very conditional. And sometimes this can act as hard removal for very cheap, but a lot of times this could act as literally nothing. And that has to be taken into consideration when judging a card like this, to the point where this card is probably something close to a 2.0. This could end up as a 1.5, it can end up as a 2.5, but I don't think I'd ever go higher than 2.5, and 2.5 is still a stretch for me. Just the fact, like, removal that relies on the number of creatures you control is always really difficult to make work, because it's difficult to have 3 or more creatures on a board at a given time, and that's really what you're kind of looking for a card like this, is you want to be able to remove a creature by dealing 3 or more damage for this sort of all conditions required standard. In fact, the more I think about it, the closer it gets to just being a 1.5. So this is the sort of thing that you look for if you're desperate for removal, if you have a lot of tokens, but I'm just not a fan. Just a lot of conditions put on this card. And it's never going to do a ton of damage. Usually it's going to do something like 2.3 damage, even in aggressive decks. And for 1 mana, with all the conditions put on, it's just not very good. Prized Griffin. Oh yeah, we've seen like a billion of these 5 mana 3/4 flyers. I mean, they're still not that good. They're not terrible. I still think they're slightly better than most people give them credit for. However, they're just still not worth quite the mana that you're investing. Probably give it a 1.5. I've never loved this sort of card. I think Enforcer Griffin was the last printing. Yeah, Enforcer Griffin was probably the last 3/4 flyer for 5. I don't really think people played that. And so they were pretty desperate. Anyway, Rally for the Throne. 3 mana for 2/1/1s, instant speed. So you're paying 3 mana for Raise the Alarm. That seems bad to me. Very bad. Raise the Alarm is worth it, but isn't a particularly powerful card. Raise the Alarm is a 2.5 usually. So paying a whole extra mana for Raise the Alarm is just not playable. What's the Adamant? Life gain? Yeah, don't bother. 1.0. This card is way too expensive for what it does. Realm Cloaked Giant. So this is the Wrath effect. Yeah, I'm always a big fan of Wrath cards. 5 mana Wrath is still perfectly good and limited. And the fact that you get to Wrath and then have a guaranteed big follow-up is really, really powerful and limited. Yeah, this card is just bananas. It's so, so good. This could end up being my 5. However, right now we're going to give it a 4.5. This card is easy pack one, pick one material. Like, this might be the best bomb in the set, but even if it's not, it's going to be top. A very, very top card in this set. For limited, especially. Righteousness. Oh, man. Nostalgia. I always love when they reprint Righteousness, just because I get to remember that this card used to be a rare that people considered good. Anyway, Righteousness is a lot of not particularly good stuff. So let's talk about the conditions of Righteousness and why it's probably better than Outflank, but it's close to Outflank. But let's just talk about how bad Outflank is, because it's worse than Righteousness. But like, Outflank, you can attack in and make use of it, but Righteousness, you actually get to kill things with consistency. And killing things with consistency is way better than the upside of being able to attack in. Anyway, Righteousness. So your opponent attacks you. You have to first be able to block. Second, not be winning the combat. Third, cast Righteousness without your opponent having a response of a bounce spell or a removal spell. And fourth, even if all that works, you traded Righteousness. Yeah, I mean, if all that works, it's actually pretty good. But the risk is very inherent to the card. I'm not going to say the Righteousness is strictly bad. I'm actually going to say that it's okay in the right spots and the right decks. However, it's a lot of conditions. And the upside is like of them attacking into you, being able to block, you casting Righteousness, eating their creature for Righteousness, and them not having a response is a lot. And it's more than it looks. Righteousness gets a solid 1/5. Maybe 2/0. Yeah, Outflank is worse than Righteousness by a significant amount. I hate Outflank. This card is garbage. Why did I even call it like a potential 2/0? This card is really bad. I'll give Righteousness a 1/5 and we're lowering Outflank to 1/0. The card is just complete trash. I would be really, really desperate to want to play Outflank, and even that I probably wouldn't. So the more I think about Outflank, especially it really helps to look Outflank at it side by side with a card like Righteousness, because Righteousness is like a situational card and has a lot of chance to just get completely fucked. And Outflank is even more situational, doesn't do as much when it works, and when it doesn't work, then you're just like feeling real bad. Anyway, Shepherd of the Flock. So the Oresco Swiftclaw of the set, I'm okay with the Oresco Swiftclaw. And the upside is you get the Dramatic Rescue. I know there's plenty of cards that do this, but Dramatic Rescue is always the one I think of. Yeah, I mean, it's a fine card. People probably overrate it because they're like, oh, well, you can bounce your other adventure cards to your hand, but really adventures, with the exception of a few like Realm Cloak Giant, are slight upside on what the body should be. The body should hold most of the weight limited. So the fact that you get to recur an adventure creature potentially is not going to be significant for most adventure creatures. Obviously, there's some exceptions, but usually this is just a Oresco Swiftclaw. That said, an Oresco Swiftclaw that could have some upside in the late game with ETB effects and with adventures is always something I'm quite happy with. It's very hard for a 3/1 to not be relevant on the board. I mean, it's not that hard. They could have like a 1/4, like the 1/5 Reach Spider that's in the set. But even then, it's a technically relevant blocker, and the fact that your 2-drop has some upside in the late game is always something I'm looking to be happy with playing. So 3.0, really solid. Not going to be a 3/5, that's way too high, but a solid 3.0. I'm a fan. Shining Armor. I hate cards like this because they're so fucking hard to evaluate. Because at first glance, you're like, +0/+2 in Vigilance is not significant enough. On second glance, you're like, well, it has Flash and it auto-equips. Then at third glance, you're like, it's still +0/+2 in Vigilance. And that's still not good. So in the end, yeah, this card's just not good enough. There are some situations where it could do some work. They're very, very situational situations that doesn't help you win the game any faster, and it costs you a whole card. And that's the issue with a card like this, where it has very little impact, is that, yes, it can do some things, and those things are relevant. However, they're not consistent enough and typically not worth enough to be worth a whole card in Limited, and that's what really holds a card like this back. So we're going to call it a 1.0. 1.5 is fine. Really, this card will shine more in decks that are super heavy on flyers. Giving this, I would much rather have like this with a bunch of flyers than this with a bunch of knights. Because +0/+2 in flying is relevant for the clock with flyers. However, the equip cost is still quite significant. It's just a lot of eh. If there's a blue-white flyers deck, you could, in theory, play this as a 23rd. But that's still a stretch. Anyway, Silver Flame Ritual. Yeah, I mean, they're really not making my job easy. So, okay, anyway. Put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. How much is that worth? 1, and you need more than 1. So let's say we're talking like lead by example. Was worth 2 mana. This was pretty vanilla. It wasn't that stellar, it wasn't that bad. It was instant speed though, which was quite relevant. We look at a card like Shoulder to Shoulder. Another good example of a card that shows that 2 counters is worth about 2 mana. So how many counters do we want for 4 mana? Well, you could make the argument that it scales linearly, but that's not quite right. 3 counters is worth 3 mana technically, but it's worth more than 3 mana because at a certain point you're getting that impact on the board, you're getting more impact on the board. So 3 counters is closer to something like 3.4 mana, which Silver Flame Ritual is still 4 mana, and even with Vigilance that's still kind of a little short. The Vigilance is probably worth, if you put 3 counters on creatures and gave all your creatures Vigilance, this would be worth about 3.7 mana. It would still be slightly too expensive, but it wouldn't be unreasonably expensive. If you put 4 counters on creatures, i.e. you have 4 creatures in play, this is a good card. It's just no other way to say that. It's just a good card if you have 4 creatures in play. And if you have 4 creatures in play and use 3 white mana to cast this card is great. It was really, really good. The problem is, having 3 creatures in play is not good enough to justify this even with the Adamant. Not quite. It's really close. And the fact that 3 creatures isn't enough to make this particularly good means you're asking a lot to make this card viable. And you're asking just way too much to make this card good. So cards probably like a 1.5. I imagine there's some decks that could abuse this. However, most decks aren't going to be able to make this card really stand out. And even when it stands out, it's not going to straight win you the game most of the time, whereas a card like, when it stands out, it could win you the game, but it's a huge ask. Having 4 creatures on your side of the battlefield is a big ask. Your opponent's going to interact with you, you're going to have to get in combat. It's just way too much to ask for a card like this. So yeah, 1.0, maybe 1.5. Probably border closer to 1.0 though, honestly. Silver Flame Squire, so 2 mana, 2/1. This is not typically a good body, obviously very exploitable by 1/4s, 1/5s, 1/3s, 1/1s. But let's take a look. And it doesn't get enough damage to justify it, unlike a Resco Swiftclaw where the extra power is significant. Anyway, let's take a look at the upside here. What is that card called? Well, there's Gift of Growth unkicked. Yeah, Savage Surge. Why wasn't it showing up? Anyway, so we have Savage Surge for an extra mana. But when we talk about a 3+2 card, overall we're talking something that costs about 4 mana in terms of relative to CMC in terms of power level. So something that costs about 4 mana. And you're getting this plus this. This body is worth about 1.5, probably closer to 1.3. This is worth 2 mana. So 3.3 plus 0.7, it's about 4 mana. So this is about correct in terms of value. Nothing stellar, but nothing bad. I'm going to give it a 2.0. The On Alert really, really helps it. You probably have to cast On Alert to make this card particularly useful. But I'm a fan. Sir Aelin, the Lion's Claw. That's a good body. 5 mana, 4/4 first strike. And it attacks as a 5/5 first strike that gives all your other attacking creatures +1/+1. I mean, that's just a really good card. He's obviously, like, standalone, a very good attacker, a good blocker. And when you start adding in other creatures, he just becomes really stellar. This is a 3.5 for sure. Good card. Trapped in the Tower. So yeah, for non-flyers, this is an arrest, which is obviously great. The situation of not being able to enchant flyers is not irrelevant, but not relevant enough to change the fact that it costs 2 and it's an arrest. So 3.5. Really good. True Love's Kiss. I mean, it's just too expensive. It's a sideboard card, but it's still probably too expensive. 1.0. I mean, I guess it is worth boarding it in if your opponent has significant amounts of artifacts and enchantments. So 1.0 still, but yeah, don't play it in your main deck. Yeah, 1 mana 2/1. It's a 3.0 body on its own. This upside is nice. If you're playing dedicated knights, this could go up to a 3/5. If you're playing a deck with some knights, like 4 or 5 knights, this is closer to it's just going to be a 3/0. But if you're playing like 7 or 8 knights, this card definitely can go up to a 3/5. This card is excellent. Worthy Knight. Oh, look. I'm going to say the exact same thing I said about Venerable Knight about Worthy Knight. You're playing like 4 or 5 knights, this is a 3/0. You're playing 7 or 8 knights, this is a 3/5. It's never going to be a 4/0, but it's going to really shine in dedicated knight decks. So yeah, treat these pretty similarly in Limited. In Constructed, different story. Let's not say that they're the same thing in Limited as they are in Constructed, though they probably go in the same deck in Constructed too. Anyway, Youthful Night. 2 mana, 2/1 first strike. Riot Piker. Obviously better than Riot Piker because it doesn't have to attack. This actually is not a bad blocker. With Knight synergies, it's great. Following up a Venerable Knight could be really good. Like if you get the counter on this, that's nice. But even ignoring specifically this card, 2 mana, 2/1 first strike is a card I would play. It still has a lot of the same weaknesses: 1/3s, 1/4s, 1/5s, 2/3s, etc. But at the same time, there was a Boros card too. It's like whatever's your turn at first strike. At the same time, this is just a fine 2-drop. The 2.5, this is a backbone 2-drop. Yeah. So that's it. I mean, we can go over the best white card, which was fairly obvious, is Harmonious Archon, I believe. Let's just make sure of that. No, sorry, Realm Cloak Giant, and then Harmonious Archon. I think I like Realm Cloak Giant more. This card just wins the game for you. Like basically every time. Harmonious Archon usually wins the game for you, but not every time. Yeah, probably every time. Those 2 cards are just ridiculous. They're on their own level here. I guess we can do top 5 commons. Definitely have the Tactician in there. This card probably makes it, but it could not make it. I'm just going to put it in for now. Outflank is garbage. This card could be in the top 5. This card definitely is in the top 5. It might be the best. Yeah, kind of a brutal top 5 here. There are some standout cards here. Probably like this. How do I feel about these two? I think this is probably better. The Knight synergy is kind of nice. and it is better as a creature on curve. How do I feel about Flutterfox versus Youthful Night? I like Flutterfox more. Okay, so I'm going to say, yeah. We have a number 5, Silverflame Squire, number 4, Youthful Night, number 3, Flutterfox, number 2, Arden Veil Tactician, number 1, Trapped in the Tower. Some good commons here. These are really the 5 commons you're looking for in most of your decks, and some of them are kind of low end. I wouldn't play more than potentially 1 or 2 of these, for instance. I wouldn't play more than 2 of these. There are some decks I played more than 2 of Flutterfox in, but usually this is about 2, sometimes 3. Arden Tactician and Trapped in the Tower are definitely on their own level in terms of being the best 2 commons in white, for sure. Yeah, that's about it. White's looking pretty good. Pretty standard, honestly, in terms of power level. So, not something I'm going to shy away from drafting in limited. Alright, we'll be back with blue.